Uncertainty is everywhere right now, and it's not just affecting the headlines. It's shaping how teams lead, how people feel, and how decisions get made. At Slingshot Group, we see it every week. Pastors and non-profit leaders navigating tough choices, burnout, and big transitions. With all this uncertainty, it's no surprise that more people are exploring what's next. That's why today's episode feels especially timely. I'm joined by Jena Dunay, leadership coach and founder of Recruit the Employer. She's passionate about helping people lead well in the now and prepare for what's next. So whether you're leading a team through change or looking for your next opportunity, this conversation is for you. Well, Jena, we are thrilled to have you on the podcast today. And for those who aren't familiar with you yet, can you give us a quick overview of you and your story?
Sure. So my name is Jena Dunay, and I actually started off my career on Wall Street, and that's actually where I met Jesus. So that's a longer conversation for a different day, but it was where I started my career, and I realized quite quickly that that life wasn't for me. And so from there, I actually jumped into the HR talent space. Over the past decade or so, I've been in there and now run an organization called Recruit the Employer, which is an outplacement agency that helps companies navigate the challenges of layoffs and post-layoff.
So Jena, what was it personally that led you to this work?
I was in a career that did not fit how I was wired or how my God-given abilities. And I kind of fit myself into it, and it didn't work. It didn't work well. And I was striving and straining, and just all of the things that could possibly go wrong in a career. Was burnt out, just all the bad things. And I started this exploration to figure out, how did God design me? How was I wired? And how could I then find an opportunity that aligns with that? And so through that process, I found another job. I was in that HR talent space in a variety of different capacities. And I really people started asking me for help. Like, how did you do that? How did you make such a big pivot? I went from finance to a sales role and working in HR. Like, how did that all happen? And I realized that I had a gift in helping people, and I had a gift for coaching people and helping them see themselves differently than perhaps they had, only seen themselves. So for me, it was out of my own journey, but then realizing that I could be helpful for people as well. And then specifically on the outplacement side of things, I had a career coaching business for about 5 or so years, solely working with people one-on-one. And I would have people that were laid off, and they would come to me and said, hey, this company hired, these career coaches, this outplacement firm. It wasn't very good. It wasn't very effective, but I need to hire you and pay out of my pocket to hire you to make me a better candidate in the candidate marketplace. And I was like, what is this? Why is there so much waste going on? Why are we wasting all this money? And so as I explored the world of outplacement, I realized that there was a lot of gaps for candidates and for a modern way of helping people find jobs post-layoff. And so that's really the impetus for starting that, was to cut back on waste, to help companies better spend their money, but also to give dignity back to those people that are going through the layoff. Like, they deserve to have, companies can perform layoffs with dignity, and people can receive dignity upon being laid off. And I just fully believe that.
Well, Jena, as I've gotten to get to know you, it is a genuine gift you have to help people, and you're so interested in people's stories. And I see the alignment with how you want to bring health to what can be a really stressful space. I'm going to talk more about that today. Just like how Slingshot was started 17 years ago to bring health to the transition space and to the leadership growth space. But you referenced a few moments ago, Jena, the uncertainty of these days. And this uncertainty feels like it's trickling through organizations and having a noticeable impact on culture and overall team morale. I mean, there's so many things going on in our world, in our nation. There's such a feeling of uncertainty. Why do you think we're experiencing such an uncertain period, both professionally and personally?
I mean, that could be its own podcast episode, but there are a couple of reasons, right? So there's the world that we live in now, which is very digitally driven. So we're talking about professionally, right? If you pop onto LinkedIn, you're going to see layoff, after a layoff. After a layoff, you're going to see people disgruntled about maybe returning to office, or you're going to see people that have opinions about what's going on in the political landscape and how that's affected into work. And I think that piece of it just brings it into our face a lot more than typically we would see maybe 5, 10, 20 years ago. So there's that piece of it. But I also think it really comes down to we've in a good way bring our whole selves to work. But in bringing our whole selves to work, we now expect our employers to be everything for us. And that can cause a lot of friction for leaders who cannot accommodate everything for everyone on every single subject that's out there. And so being a leader at an organization and being discerning and figuring out what things matter most to their employees and which things they can serve and which ways that they can actually deliver on some of those things that are important to their employees, it becomes really contentious and not knowing really where to prioritize the time. So I think it's the digital piece, but I also think it's this idea that we're now bringing our whole selves to work, which is beautiful, but also can be really challenging for leaders.
We are hearing so much more real time from so many more people about how they feel because they have this social media platform where they can express how they feel real time.
For better or for worse.
For better or for worse. And we're dialing into it. And then the piece you bring about bringing your whole self to work, it is a beautiful thing, but it is a complicated thing. I mean, it's like a marriage. You can't expect your spouse to meet all your needs.
Exactly.
You have to focus on how to stay healthy in your work environment. And I think people who are focusing on self-care and personal health are the ones that are thriving more in this season. We just released a free guide on how to build and retain a remarkable team. And in that guide, we hit on the heavy toll that burnout is having on our teams. Speaking of self-care and personal health, 42% of pastors have considered quitting full-time ministry. And that stretches over to the nonprofit ministry-focused organizations. And then 95% of nonprofit leaders worry about staff burnout. So as we're talking about uncertainty and the toll it's taking on all of us, how did those stats hit you? And what thoughts does that bring up about those kinds of stats that we're seeing?
Yeah. I'm not just surprised that those are some of the stats. And two, it makes me sad that those are some of the stats that we're seeing. It's funny. We live in this world now we have all these digital tools that are supposed to make us more efficient. So we should have more free time. But in fact, I feel like all that it's done is create a manicness to get more done at all times and be everything to everybody. And so I feel for especially those that are pastors that are feeling that burnout and just, I believe that there's probably a lack of support for those individuals that are feeling that burnout. They don't feel seen. They don't feel heard. They don't feel like they can take a break or they can create boundaries. And that I feel like is a bigger issue that we're seeing, not just in the nonprofit and faith-based space, but beyond as well. And so I think that's it's a common trend that's happening in the for-profit sector. And it's now trickled its way into, the ministry sector and the nonprofit sector. So it's not surprising, but it does make me sad.
And I wonder, Jena, is it really that people are burning out because they're working too many hours? I mean, maybe because we know that people are working hard.
Sure.
Or is it the weight of the uncertainty that we talked about?
I think it's more the weight.
Okay, talk a bit more about that.
I think it's more the weight because I do think that there, especially for ministry people that where like life and work, there's really no separation at all whatsoever. I definitely think there's some of the overwork that's happening in terms of hours and availability perhaps, but I also think it's just the emotional clatter clitter clatter that's happening between our ears as we're going through these really uncertain times and not knowing what's ahead and not knowing how to plan for what's ahead can be really, really stressful for leaders. And that can take its emotional toll. I know that when I have like a really big decision to make for myself in my little small business that doesn't really impact that many people, it is very weighty. I can imagine that whenever you have all of these people that you're responsible for and responsible to, it is really overwhelming, the emotional weight and the emotional burden that can physically have on your body, that can physically have on your mental state. And then it's just going to trickle down into how your family life is as well, right? If we're not doing well personally, we're not going to be doing well professionally or amongst our families.
Mm. Speaking of that weight, it's not unusual for us to connect with nonprofit or church leaders who are
Yeah.
facing a situation where they just have to do layoffs. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
part of stewarding that organization,
Totally.
it's part of stewarding the mission. We know that layoffs from time to time have to happen. Share
Exactly.
your thoughts on what you've observed here and the weight the leaders feel that you talk with about layoffs and how carrying that is so weighty.
It's so weighty. I want to first say that you're seen as a leader. I think a lot of leaders immediately, right? The first thing you see on LinkedIn or on maybe perhaps a different, site or amongst your friends is, oh my gosh, I can't believe the company did this or the organization did this or the church did this. And there's just all the negativity and you're the bad guy. When actually, to your point, it may be necessary in order to steward what is there already. And so I just want to let the leader know that you're seen. You're not a bad person because you have to go through a layoff. You're not a bad leader necessarily if you have to go through a layoff. Not every layoff is a product of bad decision making. Sometimes layoffs happen because of economic conditions that are outside of your control,
Mm,
because of other things that are going on within the organization. Sometimes layoffs, or I would just say even general offboarding of employees, it doesn't even have to be mass layoffs. Sometimes maybe somebody's not a good culture fit, and that is a problem. And so maybe we need to offboard them lovingly and well. But I would say first, just to make sure that people feel as leaders that you're seen and you're not the bad guys, just to remind
mm,
yourselves that you're not the bad guys. The second thing that I often see is this is not an area that is often talked about. That is often because people don't want to talk about it, right? We don't want to talk about having to go through layoffs. We don't want to talk. I talk about the thing no one wants to talk about all day long is layoffs and letting people go. And I call it the offboarding process. If we have a really robust onboarding process for new employees, new staff members, we should equally have a thought through offboarding process,
mm,
whether we have to fire one person, whether we have to lay off a bunch of people, whether somebody's just a really not a great culture fit and we need to transition them well. There should be a solid offboarding process, just as good as the onboarding process. And when organizations spend the time doing that, which by the way, most do not. So that's why
mhm.
we're talking about that. This is a
Right.
huge thing that most organizations don't do or don't think about until they have to think about it.
Mm,
And then it goes sideways because they haven't thought about it.
mm,
And so the communication strategy gets all messed up. Things are not communicated clearly. There's no plan in place. What are we doing for severance? How are we thinking about how we're communicating to our employees that are left behind? Like there's all these big questions that need to be answered, at least in part, before the actual layoff happens that most organizations aren't doing. So my second recommendation beyond, hey, give yourself a breather and it's not totally your fault all of the
mm.
time, right? As a leader, the second part is create a plan. So it really isn't your fault.
Yeah.
So you really can truly lay off people with dignity.
Yeah, I love that, laying people off with dignity, because you so often hear leaders say there's no good way to lay somebody off.
But
There's
there
no good
is.
way to. Yes, I know.
There is.
And there is, and I think you touched on that. I overheard you and our friend and author Jordan Rayner speaking recently, and we had him on our podcast. You've been
Yeah,
on
he's so
his.
great.
You're great friends, and the term you guys used was fire your neighbor as you would fire yourself.
Yes.
And my ears got going on that, because it's like, oh, I want to hear more about that, because that speaks to the fact that there is a right way to lay off people. Let's chat a little bit more about that.
Yeah, if you're thinking about somebody that is about to get laid off, my recommendation, if you have to go through a layoff, what are they thinking about? What are their thoughts that are going through their brain? They're probably going to feel betrayed. They're probably going to feel uncertain. They're probably going to feel panicked. They're probably going to be worried. They're probably going to feel ashamed, right?
Mm,
All of those emotions are very real emotions for somebody that is going through a layoff. I have been laid off before.
mm,
I was planning to leave the organization and I still felt all of those emotions,
mm,
even though I had a plan in place of what was happening next. So the very real realities of the emotional things that happen for a family, not even to mention the financial aspect that can panic, obviously, for obvious reasons, individuals that are being laid off. There are ways to have the conversation in a dignified manner. There are support things to put into place in order for people to feel as though it's a softer landing as they're getting laid off. And then the third thing is making sure that you are supporting those people that are left behind, that have this perhaps guilt complex about like survivor's guilt kind of. It's a very real thing in organizations. And there has to be a rebuild season of building trust back up between leadership and employees. And leaders in between leaders too, as well. So there has to be kind of all three of those components that an organization is thinking through when they're going through a layoff.
It's interesting. People will often talk to us about hiring friends.
Mm.
And we'll often say, and you've heard it said, that if you're going to hire a friend, you've got to be prepared to fire a friend.
Yep.
And it's interesting because we talk a lot about leadership succession. You know this, Jena, and people ask us, when should we be thinking about succession? We say every day. I actually think, as I'm listening to you, the best advice we can give to leaders listening is, when should you be thinking about layoffs and firing people? You should be thinking about it every day.
Yeah.
You should be investing in it every day in the way you onboard your team members, but also in the ways that you conduct one-on-ones and communicate throughout their employment. Because if you're communicating openly and honestly and consistently, then when it comes time to lay off that team member, hopefully it's not a surprise.
Yeah.
If you have communicated well and it is a surprise, then that's not on you. If you haven't communicated well and it's a surprise, then you have to take some responsibility for that. What would you add to those thoughts?
No, I would absolutely say that's true, especially if we're talking about for performance reasons, right? So if we're thinking about somebody who has to be let go because of maybe performance, they absolutely should not be shocked that they are getting let go for performance reasons. And I would also say, even from the more macro level, there's a way to be, and I think this is an interesting, I have this conversation with leaders too, is there's a way to be transparent, but not overshare. And I think that's a fine line that leaders really struggle with, of how do I be transparent, but not create panic, and I don't overshare too much. Like there's this fine line, but I think being honest in like an all hands meeting, or even in one-on-ones, like you suggested, of being honest about where the organization is and where it's going and where some of the troubles are and what we need to do together as a group to solve for that issue. And that you're moving towards solving for that issue. But if in the process that a layoff has to happen as part of it, that you're communicating effectively why the layoff happened, what the organization is looking to do to remedy the issues that they were, facing, for those especially that are left behind, and for those that are departing, that they make it as easy as possible. I have some great stories of some leaders at organizations who did above and beyond to make sure that the people that they were letting go felt like they had created value for the organization, because they knew what value they created. They were aware about what went wrong. And then ultimately they helped them land on their feet and find the next opportunity. I always say, for people that come through our program, it's like, hey, this might be the worst day, but this might be the beginning chapter of something really wonderful for you. And let's focus on that, because we can't control what just happened, but we can control how you look forward at this next part of your professional life.
Right. You touched, Jena, there a little bit on transparency.
Yeah.
When leading a team through uncertain times and through these kinds of seasons, how do we balance openness with discretion?
Yeah, there's a grid that I usually advise leaders to think through. Will this build trust, or will this erode trust? And so by sharing this one thing, will it make them trust us more, or will it make them trust us less? So whenever you're thinking about oversharing, maybe it's like, okay, these are what's happening with our financials, or here's what's happening with our fundraising. And being matter of fact about it is very different than almost using a gossipy tone towards what's going on. I think it's really about tone. You could still say the same thing in two totally different ways that builds trust and one way that erodes trust. So it's really around you as the leader, how you communicate things, who you communicate it to, and ultimately how you are translating that information to the people that need to know on a need-to-know basis. So I think it's really a combination of all of those things together that is the difference between transparency and oversharing.
Yeah, we coach a lot about consistent communication
Yep.
in the job and employment cycle, and allowing the team member or the employee to lead the one-on-ones, because you learn a lot about that team member by the
Yep.
feedback they give you. But when it comes to giving feedback, which you absolutely need to do, because when
Hmm.
it comes time, if necessary, to lay off or move a person on, they need to not be surprised. Matt on our senior leadership team always says you can give feedback on two things: what somebody did and how they did it, what they said and how they said it.
Yeah,
And
that's good.
using that as a filter for the communication you give, but absolutely giving clear communication so that
Hmm.
leader can grow in their role, or if it's time for them to move on. And often, I mean, we want to always be praying that we're a part of what God is already doing in this
Right.
leader's life that we're leading.
Yes.
They want to be prepared and not surprised. So
Hmm.
before we move on, because I want to transition from the leader to the team member, the employee,
Yeah.
to those leaders listening today, what are you doing today to prepare the leaders you lead for growth, and to make investments today that if the time comes that you do have to move that leader on, that it's done in a healthy and God honoring way? What things are you doing today? Be thinking about that. So I want to talk a little bit more about the employee or the team member, Jenna. Some people listening are actively looking for a new role.
Hmm.
And we obviously get calls a lot from leaders who are sensing God is leading them to a new season. We are all the first question we always ask is, are you released from your current season? Because
Hmm.
God is always doing a work in you, and you don't want to
Yeah.
leave before you're released, because then you're not ready for the next season.
Right.
But whether it be a layoff, a misfit on culture or role, or just being ready for a new challenge, I know many of our listeners are open to or considering new roles and opportunities. So what advice do you have for those who want to position themselves, wait for
Hmm.
it, for their dream job in this climate? That's a big statement, a big dream job.
Yeah. Well, one, I would like to clarify that I don't believe that there is any one dream job for anybody, because to what our conversation was earlier, that puts a lot of pressure on the employer to do all the things and all the fulfilling for you, or a career to fulfill you. And only God can do that. Let's be clear.
Mhm.
And I can say that because I've been guilty of that and continue to have to refine myself on
Well,
that
well, I set you up.
idea.
I set
Yeah.
you up, Jenna. And also, you set me up by saying on Wall Street, you
Yeah.
probably walked down Wall Street thinking that
Yeah.
was probably going to be your dream job.
Oh, totally.
And
It was everybody else's dream job. Why would it not be mine?
right,
Right.
right.
And so I think a lot of it, to your point, one, there is no dream job. So let's just clarify that. There are different great careers and occupations for different seasons. And so I think that there's a lot of power to that phrase. And I think a lot of people use it because we love to feel like we're in our dream job. But I think there are a very small amount of people that are actually in their dream job. And they're probably people that are masters of their craft, like athletes, musicians, like that kind of thing. Like I think that for the majority of us, I think a dream job is a dream job in a dream season.
But
And
Jenna,
so,
think about that. I mean, athletes, master artists, they're never satisfied.
no, true.
I bet you they would say they're not living out their dream
Yeah.
job because
Well,
they're just not quite good enough.
yes. And I think there's also this idea that there's always going to be something that's not perfect. And so if you're 80% of the way with an organization, it's a good fit probably for you,
Mm-hmm.
And if you're using the top 2 or 3 of your giftings at that organization, it's probably still a really great fit for you. So actually my first recommendation to somebody who's going through a transition is stop, drop, and roll, and do not do your resume, because that is the number one thing I see most candidates do is they want to jump to writing their resume when they have given themselves zero thought to what is God doing in my life? How am I wired? What do I need in this next season? Right? Those are really important questions that are going to inform how you write your resume. And so it's not that writing your resume or updating your LinkedIn or whatever, your portfolio, it's not that those things are not important. It's just the wrong step.
Right.
Even if you are going through a layoff. So in our outplacement program, the very first thing that we do with people is we help them get their mindset right and rebuild their confidence. That we start from the very beginning, because it is so important to do that before you write your resume. Because if you're not feeling good about yourself, your resume is probably not going to showcase the best of you, right?
Right.
And so that's the first piece. And then the second piece is giving yourself some time and space, even if it's just a couple of days. Let's say you got laid off and you're like, I need to find a job ASAP. Totally understand that. Give yourself 48 hours.
Yes.
And at least allow yourself this space to think about, what do I want? How am I wired? What is God saying this season? And then also, what are the opportunities that are out there? So many people do the opposite. We're like, what are the opportunities? Let me do my resume and let's just go for it. When we need a little bit of space first in order to be more strategic long-term. And it actually takes less time when you're more strategic that way. So those would be the top two things that I would do.
I want to dig a little deeper into some of those.
Sure.
Firstly, I loved how you responded to the dream job title, because so often we see leaders missing out on what God could be doing in
Totally.
their season of transition because they don't stop, drop, and roll,
Mm-hmm.
and then be still, which is kind of scriptural, before the
Yes.
Lord. Because so often, Jenna, we settle for good and miss out on God's great.
It's so true.
And I will personally, when I'm talking to leaders in transition, I will say, gosh, if you could at least take 3 weeks not to think about next, just to be still and seek out what God may have for you in this season. But I know not everybody can afford that luxury.
Right.
But I would also challenge today, Jenna, that we need to trust God's provision for us.
Mm-hmm.
If we are seeking God, He's going to provide for us in the meantime. And that's part of the blessing. You know, when people are coming out of really stressful leadership environments, I'll often suggest, if there's any way you can take a 3-month sabbatical, personal sabbatical. But I know that that's not only scary financially, it's also scary to sit with yourself for that long.
Yes, I would agree. I would think that for myself.
Oh yeah, me too. And we operate at such a high level, Jenna, that it becomes a drug to us.
Yes,
You know,
it's so true.
It's like when I take my my teenager's phone away for a day or two, and the first day is frightening because it's dopamine withdrawal. Well, let's not think for a second that we have our own form of dopamine, that we are sensing and feeling every day of our leadership lives. So your encouragement to stop and be still, yes, at least 48 hours, but if it could be 3 weeks or longer, it's only going to put you in a better place.
I firmly believe that. I agree with that 100%. You're spot on.
You talked about restoring confidence before you build your resume. What could you dig into that a little bit more and talk about how you do that?
Yeah, very practically speaking, pull out a piece of paper and write down all of the negative things that you are believing about yourself, your career, the possibilities for the future, all of the negative talk that's happening in between your ears. And there's probably more than you even realize, even if you're making a strategic career move, even if you're not getting laid off, but especially if you are in between jobs, you absolutely need to spend that time to write out what are all the things that are negatively keeping space in your brain. And then you need to counter it with truth. Is that true? The question I always ask people is that true 100% of the time? The answer to every single one of those things that are going through, I've done this with so many people. The answer is always no. Because 100% of the time, it is not true. Like there's a common one that I often get is, I'll never find a job in this market. I see that one a lot right now. Like, it's really hard. I'm never going to find a job. Is that true 100% of the time? Do you really believe that? And they're like, well, no, I guess not 100%. I guess there is a percentage chance. And so if you start to unravel some of that, you have to do some of that deep work of knowing, of thinking through, what am I believing about what God has for me, right? That's just basically saying, well, God, you don't have possibility. Look what's happening in the markets right now. There's no possibility that I could find a job or find something that's going to, provide for my family. And I just think that's a load of hogwash. I just don't think that's true 100% of the time. So that's a very practical strategy that we remind people. But especially if you're a person of faith, this is the time where you should be reminding yourself of who God says you are. And reiterating scripture and saying scripture over yourself is such a powerful tool during this season of wait, season of hiddenness, a season of when you just feel like nothing's really working. They often say that like a layoff is one of the most traumatic, especially if you go through a layoff, is one of the most traumatic things that somebody can go through in their life, like along with divorce and death. And so it feels silly to be like, oh, this just feels dramatic. No, it's a very real thing for people, especially if you pride yourself on, being a high performer or any of those things that I know that Slingshot listeners are. You need to spend that time to remind yourself of who you are and who God says you are.
Yeah, that's so important, Jenna, and not just in a season of transition and layoff, but in a season of personal inventory in the role you're
Yes.
in leadership, to write those things down and keep a personal inventory of that. Or if you're struggling in this season, to take inventory of all of those things is so important. We have often coached leaders who are ready to walk out the door
Mm,
to write their resignation letter, send us a copy and put a copy in your drafts folder. Don't send it, and
yeah.
sit with it and see how that sits with you in a day or two. Just
Yeah.
so you try that on and get a
Mm,
sense of, okay, is this really what I need to do? Because the most frustrating thing we see, Jenna, is leaders who leave before God releases them to leave,
yeah.
because he is still doing a refining work. And if you're released, God absolutely works in that
Hmm.
too.
Hmm.
Jenna, what's the final 10% for those actively looking for a new role and taking steps to prepare? You outlined a couple. What are
Hmm.
some final things that you would add to that?
Yeah. So I would say for anybody that is looking to make a move or that's kind of in between jobs, I would recommend that they focus on the relationships in their life and not just the resume. I know I'm really harping on the resume, but I think because the resume gets so much airtime online with career professionals or other career coaches that are out there, they talk about the resume so much. But I would focus on the people in your life, whether they are the people, the personal board of directors that you have supporting you through the whole process. It's actively networking, and networking doesn't have to be a nasty word. Networking is actually a really beautiful opportunity to meet new people, and just relishing and really taking in the relationships that are in your life and leveraging those over just tweaking your resume 1,000 times. Because we have found just doing this for a really long time is that people that are building relationships over time have faster they have the ability to more quickly find the next opportunity. And those that are just solely relying on the digital, I'm just going to apply online, are not as effective in their job search. So I would say it's a combination of just getting back to human in the human resources process is the
Yeah.
most important thing.
Jen, we both know that the days of sticking with one job and one organization are pretty much long gone.
Yeah.
So even if you're not looking right now, it's wise for us to always be ready for when the right next growth opportunity comes along, whether it be
Yeah.
internally with the ministry or company you're with, or whether it be outside of it. Why do you think culture has changed so much with sticking with one organization for a long time? I mean, some
Yeah.
people still are. I have been with Slingshot for many years,
Yeah.
and not planning on going anywhere. But give me your thoughts on that change.
Sure. I think it comes down to a couple of things. From a macro level, right? We have just so many more companies, right? So when I was in college, Facebook wasn't a thing, or like Instagram didn't even exist. And so you have all of these, let's just say on the tech side of things, all of these tech companies that are new, and there's just new industries that are popping up all the time. So I think that's part of it. I also think it comes back to this idea that we are hoping that maybe our employer is going to solve all of our internal issues that we're having, our fulfillment issues. And so we do hop from place to place. But I also think it's just the world that we live in is so fast moving now. So culture changes really fast at organizations, where you could join a company and the culture could be one way, and by couple years later, the culture looks drastically different because people have left, or things have happened, or the economy's changed, or ministries have changed, and that I think is a reason that people often leave as well. So
Mm.
it's just, I think, a macroeconomic. It's probably an internal thing that we need to all reflect upon. But I think it's just kind of where we're at in the world right now.
Mm. One of the many things I love about what we get to do at Slingshot is our partnerships, making up the ecosystem of how
Yeah.
we serve leaders and how we serve the kingdom. And you know how important at Slingshot Group candidate care is to us. And so I
Yes.
love our partnership with you and Recruit the Employer. But I
Yeah.
also love, and I'm excited to tell our listeners this, that Jenna, you now do work on our team
I do.
in the staffing space, which is such a great marriage with what you're doing with
Yeah.
Recruit the Employer. Talk about, real quickly as we close,
Mhm.
about what you're loving about the staffing process and the actual building of a team.
For me, I love working with organizations that really care about the culture, and they're bringing in somebody well to their organization. It's really refreshing for me, who's been in more perhaps the for-profit sector with, it's kind of like, let's get as many people in as possible. Let's not really think about these things. I feel like the clients that we get to work with are very intentional about that. And I love working with those organizations. And personally, for me, getting to be a part of the Slingshot team and how much care is put into the candidate piece, I believe is very rare from what I've just seen. And so for me, getting to experience what it's like as a candidate and get to see how much we care about the people that come through the process, that is really unique to a staffing firm and just hiring in general. And so I'm grateful to be a part of a team that handles that really, really well. Transparency and over communication, which I personally love in the recruiting process.
Well, Jena, we always say when the mission of the leader matches up with the mission of the team, that's holy work. And there's no better work than that. And the wisdom and care and enthusiasm you bring to all you do is glorifying to God. So thank you for being you and showing up how he created you to show up. And thank you for sharing your wisdom and insights with us today. How can listeners stay connected with you and the great work you're doing?
Yeah, so you can find me at recruittheemployer.com, or I'm very, very active, for better or for worse, on LinkedIn. So you can find me there at Jena Dunay.
Wonderful. Jena, thanks for being with us today, and thanks for being on our team.
Thank you. I love being on the team. Glad to be here. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with our friend Jena. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with another leader. Thanks again, and until next time, stay curious and reach for the remarkable.